So thank you very much for inviting me to this really inspiring workshop. And thank you also, Lucia and Mark and Franco, for the really fascinating and very good organization and sending trinkets to the US. I'm so pleased with this cup with the really beautiful logo. So I'm very impressed about this organization that of you to put together this conference. So when I was thinking about the topic Sumer and the sea, I first proposed that I would talk about the management of the ancient Tigris for navigation, flood control, and irrigation. But I have talked about that many times, and some of you even have seen my presentation, and it's now published. So I decided to take a little bit of a different route with this paper. And just wanted to think about what else we can learn about ancient societies by looking at the interface between water management and ancient societies. And particularly, what can we learn of early forms of governance? I mean, you're all aware that adequately describing early forms of governance does remain very challenging. And just due to the fact that the available data set has limitations. And also, we have not yet done a really systematic interdisciplinary and comparative study on that question. So while the historical record from Mesopotamia is really extraordinarily rich when compared to other early civilizations, it does tend to favor the perspective of the ruling elite. And aspects into what were outside of the government's interest or even control can often only be gleaned from archaeological evidence, which is not always readily available. So the great number of written sources also has led sometimes to the assumption that royal or state control was absolute and all-embracing. But recently, I think that scholars have paid more closer attention to the serious limitations of royal power in early state societies. Seth Richardson, for example, from the University of Chicago, has already argued that he believes early Mesopotamian states had a fairly low level of territorial control. And he refers to Michael Munn's work that he says that ancient states really lacked the infrastructural power what modern states have. So, for example, digital technologies, which really increases the capacity of modern states to control and monitor society. So, and he proposes that state power seriously diminishes the further removed a region is from centers of power. So, and based on that, I argue that key to a more nuanced understanding of early forms of governance is the ability to measure the spatial extent of state control, and also to measure the degree in which state control penetrated society. I believe that the study of ancient irrigation systems, particularly of their management, is a very productive venue to pursue that question. Irrigation systems, as you all know, are not mere agricultural infrastructures, but they're also social microcosms that can reveal quite a bit about the political and social organization of the societies that operate them. And as such, I argue that measuring the level of state involvement in irrigation may provide us with a quantitative rather than a qualitative measure of the extent of state control, particularly over the rural population. Irrigation agriculture, as you know, differs from rain-fed agriculture as you need an infrastructure that guides water away from a water source to the fields. Operating irrigation system also requires a number of tasks. They have to be obviously constructed in the first place, later be maintained. Water has to be distributed among all the water users, which can lead to conflicts. In particular, downstream users are often affected by upstream users, and there are usually sort of socio-political arrangements in place that regulate these relationships. If these agreements are violated, there's usually a judicial authority that can resolve these disputes very promptly, because if conflicts remain or prolong, it can really cripple the functioning of an irrigation system. The operation of an irrigation system also requires a fair amount of administration because each task has not only a manual component, but also an administrative component. So for example, if we think about constructing or maintaining a canal, sediments and earth has to be removed manually, but also you have to assess how much work has to be done and how that work is going to be subdivided amongst the water users, or how many laborers do you have to hire in order to get that work done. The administration may or may not be based on administration, but from ethnographic examples, we know that mostly what is recorded is who received water and who paid water fees or fulfilled related water labor duties. So in order to ensure that all the necessary tasks are performed, the management of an irrigation system is usually organized by some overseeing body. Central to the issue of the relationship between irrigation management and political centralization is the source from which the organizational apparatus or the organizational body draws its authority, which can come either from the national government, the state, or from the irrigation community itself or private investors. Private investors, though, can be excluded for ancient times because that's really a phenomenon of modern monetized economies. It's only really in the first case that we can talk about a centralized irrigation management, because the organizational staff derives its authority directly from the central government. But of course, in reality, there's always a degree. Certain states are involved very deeply and certain other states are just lightly involved. So there's a degree in that. So I want to illustrate now, based on the example of the province of Umma, what we can actually reconstruct about ancient irrigation management and how much can we measure how greatly the state was involved in its management. As you all know, the Umma province belonged to the kingdom of the third dynasty of Ur, which roughly covered the area of modern South Iraq for a little over 100 years at the end of the late 3rd millennium and the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. So my analysis was based primarily on the documents that derived from the archives of the governor of Umma, who managed an estate of about 14,000 hectares of land, with a staff of employed laborers and administrators. And the archive of the governor sector consists of roughly 30,000 tablets. So it's a huge archive. And about 3,000 to 4,000 tablets deal with irrigation specifically, but also water control more generally. And those records indicate that the operation of the irrigation in Ur-III Umma was based on a highly sophisticated administrative and accounting system. Each cuneiform tablet records the labor and material expenditure for a particular work project. But it also provides a lot of information about its administration. Usually the name of a supervisor of the work crew is given, as well as the high-level administrator who commissioned the project in the first place and also deposited his seal on the tablet to confirm that the project had been carried out. Employment rosters allow us to reconstruct the administrative hierarchy of several economic sectors. And we know that the work related to water control and irrigation was handled by the administration of the agricultural sector of Umma. Labor was organized in work gangs of 12 to 30 workers that would carry out specific work projects under the supervision of a foreman. The work to be done was usually expressed in volumes of earth to be moved, as you see here on that slide, either to clean a canal or to reinforce any kind of water control devices in the irrigation system. The most commonly found work norm for irrigation works in Umma was 3 cubic meters of earth, which is the amount of earth that one worker was expected to move within one day. It's a really high number if you compare it to ethnographic examples. The text allows us to reconstruct the individual administrative steps by which the workflow was organized in a highly efficient manner. The first step entailed the inspection of the devices of canals and hydraulic devices in different locations, followed by the surveying and measuring out of the work that needed to be done. Then the division and assignment of different workloads to different supervisors and their work crew. Obviously, the execution of work by supervisors and their work crew, the inspection of the completed work, which happens rarely, but it does, and then of course the payment of the workers and the administrators. I will not provide examples for all of these different steps just because there's not enough time, but for some I will. So this is an example of a letter order. It's not really an administrative document, but a letter order that does instruct an official called Erdingir to inspect all the flow dividers that there are in the Umma Province, in the Umma district. Sorry, that's a district within the Umma Province. Just to clarify, a flow divider in an irrigation scheme is a device that allows to split water of a parental channel into a set of smaller canals. It's obviously not completely stated, but we can assume that what he was inspecting is for possible damage that allowed to prioritize the work that needed to be done in that year. And he was probably also the one who took linear measurements based on which the work volumes then could be calculated. Probably using measuring ropes and measuring rods, which you can see here on the stele of Unama, held by God in his hand, which are the royal insignia that he's handing to Unama, who was the founder of the kingdom of the third dynasty of Ur. The computation of the work volume was done based on the basic formula by multiplying the length with the width and the depth. And the number that I have put up here is actually from an ancient text of a 7-kilometer long canal that was 12 meters wide and 2 meters deep. So the computation of the work volumes as well as the assignment of different work projects was probably done in an office setting. And what you see here are different stretches that were assigned to different supervisors of the work crew for the cleaning of a canal called the Sharagugal Canal at the beginning of the agricultural season. So that was an irrigation canal that needed to be maintained. So the text clearly showed that the provincial government under the authority of the governor managed the entire system literally down to the individual field level by relying on a great labor force of dependent and semi-dependent workers and also corvée labor. Many of the tablets are sealed by members of the governor's family, as for example, Akala, someone that has appeared a number of times now of the text that I showed you. And he is actually the brother of the governor and then assumed governorship in Umma later on after the death of his brother. Many of the male members of the gubernatorial family held key position in the administration of the agricultural sector, which shows that agriculture and in extension water control was overseen by the provincial government under the authority of the governor and his family. There's no indication that the central government, and I'm talking here about the crown, was involved in the day-to-day operation of these systems in the province. However, it is clear that major water disputes were handled by the central government. This is a court document from Umma that documents a petition by an individual called Ashtushpesh, who wanted to divert water from the Tigris, and his case was heard and trialed in the court in the presence of a royal envoy, which does indicate that central government really did retain some control over local water affairs. So at first glance, these texts do suggest a highly centralized management of the irrigation system at the provincial level, which implies a control, if not, as has been suggested, a full integration of the rural population into the state administrative structure. However, as detailed as these texts are, they do not allow us to determine whether or not the system of management was typical for the Ur III state, let alone or the Umma Province. The system might have been specific to the estate run by the governor, whose land holdings only amounted to 7% of the entire surface of the Umma region. The system may, to this point, we do not know how much arable land was under cultivation at any time and what percentage of it was managed in this highly centralized fashion, as is reflected in the texts. Moreover, the textual information does not really allow us for reconstructing the size and layout of the irrigation systems in questions, because texts really rarely document the dimensions of these control devices. The text that I showed you before is, I think, the only one that gives me all 3 dimensions of width, depth, and length, yes. So that I think there are only a couple out of these 3,000 to 4,000 texts. Also, the language itself, Sumerian, does not really allow us to distinguish between canals and devices of different sizes. So Pa'adaga is probably referring to a smaller canal. I think that's fairly certain, maybe a field canal. But for example, the term IT7 in IT2 can refer to anything, rivers, tributaries, natural or man-made canals. And it can also refer to primary and secondary canals. So based on the text alone, we will not be able to really reconstruct these systems. Moreover, we are totally in the dark about where these canals, as well as the Tigris itself, from which obviously all these canals branched off, was located. The course of the canal that you see here is primarily reconstructed on texts and some archaeology, but it has not really been confirmed yet. So as a result, we really lack the interpretive framework that would allow us to contextualize this abundance of information from the texts, and also does not really allow us to accurately interpret the degree of state involvement in irrigation and in extension, the level of state control in rural areas. What we need is a comprehensive reconstruction of Umma's agricultural landscape as well as historical geography in order to fully utilize the information from the texts. While I realize that this is an ambitious goal, I do believe a project that combines archaeological research, geomorphological research, and textual research will allow a fairly comprehensive reconstruction of Umma's agricultural landscape and geography. The Umma Survey and the Umma Geographic project are that kind of project. The Umma Survey Project aims to conduct a comprehensive archaeological reconnaissance of a 2,000 square kilometer area in the vicinity of the modern day Al-Rifai, and this is also the area where we believe that the Umma Province was located. And it aims at documenting ancient settlements, landscape features, relic watercourses, canals, and if possible, field systems. Not sure if that's possible, but I hope. So far, the Umma region has been only covered partially by the regional site service by Adams and Nissen. And for the III period, or the Isin Larsa, like the following Isin Larsa period, they have only documented 19 sites. We cannot distinguish between them because there's still issues with the pottery chronology for that period. We cannot distinguish sufficiently enough between these two historical periods. More recently, as part of a really broad cultural heritage protection effort, Abdul Amir Hamdani and his team surveyed the entire alluvial plain, including the Umma region, and he was able to document many, many more sites for the Umma region that have been previously unknown. So out of all of these sites, only 2 are actually identified with or known, like that's Umma itself and Sabalam. But the texts do actually indicate that there were at least 110, and possibly 158 settlements for the III period alone. So that's a 100-year period where we know that this area was really densely settled. So we were able to lay the foundation of the Umma Survey Project in 2 field seasons in 2018. This is the March season, and then we had another season in December. And we were able to reconstruct, to systematically survey 18 sites that date back to the 5th millennium BC, all the way to the 1st millennium AD. We were also able to confirm a gap in the occupation of this region in the mid-2nd till the mid-1st millennium BC, a finding that was also reported by Robert McCormick Adams further to the west. The widespread abandonment of sites starting in the first half of the Old Babylonian period has been attributed to rivers changing their course and leaving most of the area, with some exceptions, of the southern central alluvial plain without water. It was not until the 1st millennium BC and AD that this area was resettled and revived as a result of a concerted effort by the empires of the late antiquity to restore water supply of formerly productive agricultural areas. So we hope to continue our work this winter and also plan to conduct a geomorphological study of relic watercourses, which we suspect to be the ancient Tigris. This work will be conducted in cooperation with Dr. Jafar Yutari from Cassidy University. And we obviously hope that we can confirm that the Tigris was running through the Umma Province, for like the text leave no doubt about that. Locating and reconstructing the course of the ancient Tigris is the single most important piece of the puzzle that once constituted Umma's historical geography and ancient landscape. Written sources provide a wealth of geographic information, such as names of settlements, fields, rivers, canals, riparian forests, wetlands, you name it, it's all there. But in particular, travel itineraries, which provide clues about the spatial relationship of places to one another, record mostly journeys up and down the ancient Tigris. As a result, the location of places in the text is frequently made in reference to the ancient Tigris. Texts also provide information about the location of inlets and outlets of major canals, and in many cases because they're associated with settlements whose name we know. So knowing the course of the ancient Tigris will allow us to locate many places mentioned in the text, as well as the inlets of the major canals. The textual component of my research is conducted in the framework of a cooperation with Dr. Manuel Molina of the Research Council of Spain and Dr. Peter Steinkeller from Harvard University. The database of toponyms mentioned in the Umma text corpus has already been assembled, and Dr. Molina has already integrated it into a network analysis, which has been really quite revealing. That will help us to match geographic places mentioned in the text with archaeological settlements and places on the ground. Keeping the web of relative distances and interconnectedness of places in mind becomes particularly very confusing. Earlier attempts to manually reconstruct the Umma geography and ancient landscape based on these relative distances, as mentioned in the text, has been plagued by uncertainties and errors. The advantage of a network analysis is that it will generate a graph that you can see here of the relative distances between places and their relationship to one another, which can then be further analyzed. Such a graph would also display the relative importance of certain places with regards to the frequency as they are mentioned in the records. The result of such a network analysis will then be combined with archaeological data on the ground to inform the reconstruction of the historical geography and ancient landscape. While I'm not expecting that I will be able to locate all geographic places mentioned in the ancient records on the ground, I'm positive that we will be able to geolocate a good sample of the nodes of the network analysis on the ground, which will then allow for a fairly comprehensive reconstruction of the ancient landscape and historical geography. The greater the number of nodes that I can geolocate, the more accurate the reconstruction will be. The reconstruction will then be based on a GIS model that would allow us to combine the disparate data sets of archaeological, geomorphological, and textual data into one digital platform. That's obviously the beauty of the Geographic Information System softwares. So once this geographic context is established, we'll then have a framework to fully utilize the potential provided by the economic records and offer an in-depth description of early irrigation management, and also about the spatial extent of state control as evidenced in the operation of those systems. While I'm not expecting that I will be able to reconstruct Umma's irrigation systems, what we can see here, was based actually on satellite imagery that I traced, but now listening to Dr. Fassbinder's talk, maybe we can. I thought that like his data were just fabulous and like opens up completely new possibilities. But I am pretty certain that we can do something like that that has been done in the Gila River in Arizona, which dates to the Hohokam period. These are canal systems that were based on backhoe cuts, and you see it's a fairly comprehensive reconstruction of these ancient systems. And we can learn a lot from the canal archaeology of the American Southwest. They do fabulous things, and they have been quite pioneers also in terms of labor modeling, but they cannot test their hypothesis, how they think these systems have been managed, because they don't have text, and we do. So for us, what is actually possible, we can push that question much further than for most early states that practiced irrigation agriculture. And so I do believe that a combination of archaeology and text really will allow us to visualize the spatial extent of state control. If, as the text suggested, the provincial government was involved in the management of most irrigation systems all the way to the field level, I would argue that state control in rural areas was firmly established, as there's a frequent interaction between the rural population and the state via state officials that happens regularly if you manage an irrigation system. However, if we can show that this kind of management applied only to a handful of systems and to a limited area, we may have to rethink our conclusions and assume a more heterogenic form of early governance with a variety of agents engaged in all kinds of power dynamics that characterized these early forms of governance. Thank you very much.